Okay, we are going to be back with that interesting man, Sophronius Eusebius Hieronymus, better known as Jerome, and the Latin Vulgate. We have a few more sessions where we need to discuss some of the most recent developments with regard to Jerome's Latin Vulgate before we'll wrap up our studies in Latin translations and go on into English translations then. Sixto Clementine edition was our topic in the last teaching. And we've seen how it wasn't altogether suitable. The work done by Gregory, the intervening pope between Sixtus and Clement, was actually the one who did the work that became the final work, more or less, known as the Sixto Clementine Bible. But it appears that with the 3,000 variants that we have between the work of Sixtus and the work of pseudo-Clement, which would really be Gregory in between the two, in comparing those, the work of Sixtus was really the superior of the two. He was a textual scholar himself, and those scholars who worked under him were even superior to Sixtus himself, so that when he differed from them in their majority opinion, he inevitably was mistaken, and they were inevitably correct in their beliefs. So it's an interesting version, and as I think I said last week, it remains down to today the official Bible of the Latin Vulgate, but what I meant by that is what we'll more explain this morning and more explain the next time we look at that, is what remains of the Sixto Clementine. That was a tremendous work that was done. Nothing in the history of the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate text, had ever been done like that prior to that. Nothing had been done. It was just the Vulgate is the Vulgate, someone trying to compare and revise over in this part of Europe, and someone trying to compare and revise over in that part of Europe. The Council of Trent saying the Bible of Jerome, the Latin Vulgate, is the official Bible without telling us which edition. And, all these confusing things happen so that you get many attempted standardizations of this standard Bible. And it wasn't until the Sixtus Gregory Clementine work that was done that we have the first universally important textual work that's been done as far as the text of Jerome's Vulgate is concerned. So that's very important, and there are elements of that, and the essence of the whole theory behind what they were doing is embodied in what we have as the Vulgate today. But of course, many, many changes have been made in words and spelling and sentences and everything because, well, Latin textual studies have continued through the centuries just like Greek and Hebrew. You see, we are most concerned as biblical Christians and as Protestant Christians, we are most concerned about Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, but mostly about Hebrew and Greek since those were the languages of the autographs. We're mostly concerned about textual advancement of studies in those areas. But that doesn't mean that there weren't advancements in Latin textual studies as well. Remember how, with the last couple of centuries, we've had so many new discoveries of at least portions, and sometimes with a Vaticanus or a Sinaiticus, or especially a Sinaiticus in last century, almost complete representations of one part of the Bible, such as the New Testament. We've had tremendous discoveries made in those areas, which have improved the text of the Bible as we have it today. The same thing happened with Latin. We had our reliable manuscripts, Fuldensis, Amiatinus. We had our reliable manuscripts that have been here for centuries. But we also have had more recent discoveries in the last couple of hundred years, even in the Latin area, so that textually studies have advanced themselves, which of course the consequence of that would be the Sixtus Clementine edition of the Bible isn't as reliable as it could be. So what we need to do, and what we're going to do this morning, is look at what happened after that and bring us pretty much up to date, and then we'll just have one more time where we'll kind of wrap up everything we've said about Jerome and the Vulgate, and we'll conclude our studies in the Latin language. This will bring us right up into, the mid-20th century, what we're going to look at this morning. Okay, first of all, we're going to look at three works that were done after the time of Pope Sixtus, Pope Gregory, Pope Clement. Now, if you remember that date, that's the end of the 16th century. The Sixtine edition was published in 1590. and Gregory's work under the name Clement in 1592, the end of the 16th century. Now, I give you that because of the date involved with our first thing we're going to look at this morning. We're going to see it's been quite a lapse in time since anything has been done as far as the Vulgate is concerned. So we're going to, in other words, look at some future editions that came after the Sixto Clementine work. Okay, number one. First of all, we have a work done by Martianay. M-A-R-T-I-A-N-A-Y. M-A-R-T-I-A-N-A-Y. A partial work done by Martianay in the year 1706. So it was over a century, over 100 years elapsed before anything, period, before anything was done again with regard to the Vulgate. That is, since the time of Sixtus, Gregory, and Clement, which just goes to show how important their work must have been, how important it was thought to have been at that time in history, so that we have a skip from the year 1592, the date of the work of Gregory under the name of Clement being published, all the way up to the year 1706, before anything else, period, is done with regard to the Vulgate. So for over a century of time, and Latin studies were advancing and increasing then, but still nothing changed the Sixto Clementine Bible. So that for over a century of time, this was the Latin Bible, the official one, the best one that had ever been done. And many elements of it are still embodied and existent today in the work that now has superseded the work of these three popes, Sixtus, Gregory, and Clement. Then secondly, we have a work done by another scholar. We'll give you a little more information about him. This partial work by Martianay is not that significant. Well, neither of the first three are really that significant. We'll have to get into numbers 4 and especially 5 before they really become important. But the second man, Domenico Vallarsi. Domenico Vallarsi. D-O-M-E-N-I-C-O. Vallarsi, V-A-L-L-A-R-S-I, who lived 1702 to 1771. He's interesting because of the sleight of hand he has to pull on the Roman Catholic Church in order to do what he thinks needs to be done. He was the editor of Jerome's writings. And of course, some of Jerome's writings included his Latin Bible, remember. But Jerome wrote numerous commentaries on Scripture that brought to bear much historical and geographical information on the text of Scripture, especially, well, the Old as well as the New. And remember, he was capable of doing something like that because of the fact he lived in Bethlehem for 3.5 decades. He traveled throughout the land of Palestine. And during these days, we have scholars like Augustine, who lives way over in Carthage in North Africa, who writes commentaries and who writes works about the Bible, but he had never been there himself. And so it's a little difficult to comment with the authority that a Jerome could comment with, since Jerome had spent 3.5 decades of his life somewhere in the Middle East, somewhere in Palestine, in particular at Bethlehem, although he had done quite a bit of traveling as well. And you'll also remember from our earlier studies about Jerome that he took it upon himself to learn the Hebrew language. So he was quite knowledgeable in all of the necessary languages, and giving him Hebrew would also open the door to rabbinic studies as well, which he could do, which would have been written in Hebrew. So this Vallarsi was the editor, we're saying, of all of Jerome's writings, and just some of his writings. A very small portion included the Bible, although that was, of course, the most lasting and enduring of Jerome's works. Vallarsi published his work in 11 volumes from 1734. So you see, he was just a young man, 32 years of age at this time. From 1734 to 1742. During this period of time, these 11 volumes of Vallarsi's work on Jerome's writings, which include his Bible, came out. But of course, Vallarsi has the problem that anyone before or after him really have had, and that is the papal decree. And you remember what the papal decree was, excommunication. According to Sixtus, excommunication. If you altered a jot or a tittle, you added, subtracted, or altered a particle, he said, then you could be subject to excommunication. And so if you're ever wanting to, and you remember how Clement got around that. He said, well, what Sixtus really meant to do was after the first printing came out, he knew there'd be a lot of printing errors in that. He wanted to revise that later on. So they had a little backdoor escape also to get around the papal decree. Because not even a pope can go against another pope, theoretically. Theoretically, not even a pope can go against another pope, although we see popes fighting popes many times in the history of the Catholic Church. But he's got to practice a little sleight of hand himself, because you cannot tamper with the Vulgate. The established text is that of Sixtus. Now it's Sixtus Gregory Clementine, the established text, and you can't deal with that. You cannot alter a particle in that. But what if you happen to be an enlightened textual scholar and you feel you've got superior knowledge, superior material, superior texts? Well, you still really can't go back according to this papal decree and tamper with that at all. Yeah. So what he did is he disguised Jerome's Bible. He didn't call it the Vulgate. It was just disguised right in the midst of these 11 volumes. So it's kind of hard to find it in there. And he just disguised Jerome's Vulgate as part of Jerome's larger writings. And it was a part of Jerome's larger writings. But he was pretty sly as a fox to do it this way. Because whoever reads through 11 volumes, if you get over there to, like the second half of volume 8, and there's the Vulgate. You see, in the second half of volume 8, no one's ever going to find it over there then. So you probably won't ever end up in any trouble or hot water with the Roman Catholic Church. And he didn't, because no one took the time to read all 11 volumes. You say, well, why did he do it? Well, some people have to at least satisfy their own mind and their own conscience. And he knew he had to satisfy his own conscience. There are better things available than what we have back there in the earlier work. Really what he did was just a completion of the work of Martione. It was just simply a completion of the work of Martione. Martione just violated the papal decree, but it was a partial work, so it was forgivable. Which may have been why he did a partial work, I don't know. And then thirdly, we have Richard Bentley. Now that doesn't even sound Italian or Catholic or anything, and you're right. He was an English classical scholar, so he wasn't bound by R.C. decrees. So he was fine living up in England. If you're part of the Church of England, you're not bound by the Pope anyway. So it doesn't matter who excommunicates who. You're not even in the church to be excommunicated. So Richard Bentley lived from 1662 to 1742. Now, he was a good scholar, a good English classical scholar, a Protestant English classical scholar. England was Protestant by this time, just recently had become Protestant, really. And he promised us a fresh, new Vulgate edition. And I emphasize the word promised, because he never delivered. He died before he ever really got started on the work. So we mention him not as giving us some great work, but a great promise for a great work that was never forthcoming. Okay, now none of this work was really that important, these first three works that I've mentioned. Martione, Villars, or Bentley. None of this was really that important. Nothing came about that was important until the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think this was because of two important reasons. We'll give you those, and then we'll go into the works that were and are important. You see, all of this is taking place. Bentley dies in the middle of the 18th century. Nothing really important comes on the scene until the 19th and 20th centuries, 1800s, 1900s. And I think that's because of several reasons. And I think these are rather obvious. You maybe could even guess these yourself ahead of time. In the first place, the Roman Catholics discouraged any additional work because of the papal threat of excommunication. Some people like Domenico Vallarsi are intelligent enough to try to get around that. I still think you violated the decrees of your official mother church, though. You sinned against your church. You lied to your own church to sneak around. If you really believe in what the Roman Catholic Church stands for, and you really believe in papal infallibility, and you really believe in the authority of these bulls or encyclicals or these decrees that are published, then you should have yourself bound to them. You should bind yourself to them. Amen. And most people did, you see. Most people, that's what I'm saying here. The Roman Catholic people were discouraged. The Roman Catholic scholars were discouraged from doing any additional work because of this threat of excommunication. Who wants to be excommunicated? I'll do textual work in Greek or Hebrew or something. I'll stay away from Latin. Or if I want to do it in Latin, I'll stay away from Jerome's Bible in Latin. I'll do some other Latin work from history. I'll do some of Caesar's writings. I'll do something else in Latin. I'll stay away from Jerome's Bible. And you see, this is a very important thing. And it's been important in different eras of the church's history. Whenever such an authoritative decree is passed, it kind of discourages any further development in that area. Whenever you come across and say, this is it, not a particle will be added, subtracted, or altered. This is it. Well, there's always room for development. That could have been correct, but nothing is totally and absolutely and to every particle perfect and correct. That'd be the autographs, you see, to have something, whether it's a manuscript or whether it's a doctrine. We can all use further development as we go along, as God teaches us things. So it's something not wise to do. And it discourages, you see, any further additional work in this area. And then another reason why I think we don't have important textual work done is because Protestant scholars, see, that dealt with Roman Catholic scholars. They're discouraged by this threat of excommunication. Protestant scholars, meanwhile, are busy with what? The original languages. Protestant scholars weren't that concerned about Latin. The Bible wasn't written in Latin. Jerome's Bible was written 400 years after James wrote his Bible, his epistle. So I don't really care what Jerome had to say. Jerome comes 400 years after the time of the Apostle James. James wrote in Greek. I'm concerned about the Greek language. I'm not concerned about Jerome's Latin language. So you see, we got two different things entering in. Number one, the Roman Catholic scholars whose domain this was, that is the Latin language and textual studies in that area. The Roman Catholic scholars are discouraged from any further work because of the threat of being excommunicated from the church. So you put your pen down and don't do anything. Protestant scholars, like Richard Bentley or like some who have come after him, Protestant scholars who aren't bound by any fear of papal threats or decrees of excommunication, could care less about the Latin language. They're doing important textual studies and textual work in the original languages of Greek and Hebrew. Therefore, if you rule out all Catholics and you rule out all Protestants, you see you don't have anybody left then. That takes care of both of the big groups, unless it's an Eastern Orthodox or something, and all they want to do is study mysticism, so they're not too involved in textual studies. All you've got are these two groups of people, Roman Catholics, Protestants, and if you rule both of them out, who's going to do work in Jerome's Vulgate? No one. So the Sixto-Clementine Bible was an important Bible, but it had negative ramifications and repercussions as well. It was supposed to be so good that it prohibited anyone else from doing any further work after that time, which almost was self-defeating, because what we would want is the best available Latin Bible of Jerome's Bible that we could have. And we're being robbed of that really by the Roman Catholic threat of excommunication. Had that not been there, no doubt more Roman Catholic scholars would have jumped into the whole thing and given us a better Latin Bible, based it on the work of Pope Sixtus, but nevertheless have given us a better Bible. Well, let's go on and look at some other people in the 19th and 20th centuries who have done important work. First of all, we'll discuss a man that we have discussed, probably several years ago now, Karl Lachmann, spelled with a K, Karl Lachmann, Lachmann. Now, you'll probably remember him as one of those important German textual scholars of the 1800s. He, along with the others like Tischendorf and Tregelles, Griesbach, you remember all of those names, gave us so many of these important works, and all of that was just the groundwork, the foundation, the footing for Westcott and Hort of England, who came in the 1880s and gave us their important work, and I believe the year was 1882. Okay, so Karl Lachmann gave us a Vulgate New Testament, just a New Testament, a Vulgate New Testament, along with his Greek New Testament in 2 volumes. You see, he's noted for Greek textual studies. That's where we've heard these men's names before, people like Lachmann and Tischendorf. In 2 volumes published at Berlin between the years 1842 and 1850. A Vulgate New Testament along with a Greek New Testament. Of course, which of those do you think was the most important thing? Greek. And where was he really concentrating his efforts? Greek. But he happened to know Latin. If you're a classical scholar, you pretty much have to know Latin and Greek. They're just the two languages that go together. And so if you know Greek, you know Latin. If you're going to write a Greek Bible, why not throw a Latin one in to boot? But no one's real concerned about the Latin one because the Bible was not published, was not written originally in Latin. Okay, the upper part of the page gave us the Greek text. The lower part of the page gave us the Latin. So in other words, we've got it all here on one page. We divide and the pages were divided something like this. And of course, you generally put what's important up at the top. So we have our Greek up at the top, Latin, let's say, Matthew chapter 1 at the bottom. And then what do you think comes in the middle here? Hebrew hung between two thieves. No Hebrew here.
CA.
Yeah, CA. The critical apparatus, which generally comes at the bottom of pages. Your modern Greek Bibles will be down here at the bottom of the page. But that's a fairly good way to do it, though. If you're going to have a bilingual thing, instead of running it one line Greek and one line Latin, that's kind of confusing. Just give us the Greek of the first 3 paragraphs and then the Latin of the first 3 paragraphs, and give us our CA in between. Although I'm sure you could argue the case. Let's put CA at the bottom or at the top or in the margin. I don't guess it really matters where it goes. But my point was that certainly makes a cleavage, very clear one, between Greek and Latin. So you have your Greek up here, your Latin down here, and your critical apparatus there. His Latin, we're not too concerned about his Greek since we've studied that already. His Latin was based on the manuscripts Fuldensis. We've already mentioned these before. Fuldensis and Amiatinus. A partial copy of Amiatinus. So that was the basis of his Latin. We would have to know what's he using as the basis for his Latin text here. He used Codex Fuldensis and an incomplete, imperfect form of Amiatinus. Okay, during the same time as Lockman, and you can just all include it here under number 4, and all included under Lockman. During the same time as Lockman, some of these other scholars, the ones that I just mentioned, Tischendorf, also gave us some of the Latin Vulgate New Testament. Tischendorf, Griesbach, and Tregelles. Remember how to spell those names? Probably you do fairly well. Tischendorf, Griesbach, and Tregelles. T-R-E-G-E-L-L, Tregelles. So these men, along with Lockman, gave us some of the Latin Vulgate New Testament, but it was really never a study in itself. As I've said before, it was more or less just an afterthought. It was just attached to their more important work, which was their Greek New Testaments. But Lockman gave us an entire Vulgate Latin New Testament. The others, Tischendorf, Griesbach, Tregelles, just gave us some portions interspersed in their writings. But it was never a study in itself. Their concentration was purely with regard to the Greek New Testament. Okay, number 5, and this is where we'll spend almost all of our time this morning, concerns 2 men, Wordsworth and White. Thank you. Well, I'll just let you erase it while you're up. Wordsworth and White. Now, here's the most important work that was ever done with regard to the Vulgate. And it began during the last, thank you, it began during the last half of the 19th century. So it's going to be kind of easy to remember because it's a dual name, a dual authorship, like Sixto Clementine, Sixtus and Clement, Wordsworth, hyphen, however you want to put it, / and White, 2 different men, Professors Wordsworth and White. Okay, Bishop John Wordsworth, 1843 to 1911. Bishop John Wordsworth, 1843 to 1911, was one of the best Latin scholars of his day. And his younger Anglican colleague at Oxford, they were professors at Oxford, they were Anglicans, his younger Anglican colleague at Oxford was Dean H.J. White. So we have a Bishop John Wordsworth and Dean H.J. White, 1859 to 1934. Both a member of the Church of England, Anglicans, and both professors at Oxford. The better of the two as far as Latin knowledge would be the older of the two, Bishop John Wordsworth, one of the best Latin scholars of his day. Okay, they began the monumental work of providing the definitive modern edition of the Vulgate that began this in the year 1877. Now, a short time after that, 8 years as a matter of fact, Wordsworth became the Bishop of Salisbury in 1885. So his name, Bishop John Wordsworth, comes from the date beginning with 1885, when Wordsworth becomes Bishop of Salisbury, S-A-L-I-S, Salisbury, in 1885. Now, they've been working on this definitive modern edition of the Vulgate for the past 8 years, since 1877. What happens, do you think? What do you think happens whenever Wordsworth becomes Bishop of Salisbury with regard to their work on the Vulgate? Okay, White pretty much takes over because Wordsworth switches his responsibilities to another area, and so we're losing the best of our two scholars here as far as the Latin language is concerned. Yes, we see the influence of Wordsworth in the initial stages of the work. And as you look at the work later on, the influence of White becomes much more profound and much stronger. And I think that's very obvious because of the reasons that I've just given you and that you've already guessed yourself. Since that time, White, did most of the work. Now, in 1889, the first portion was ready for print. They've been working on it 12 years. In 1889, the first portion was ready for print, and that was an introduction to Matthew and the Gospel of Matthew. Introduction and the Gospel of Matthew. 1889. The rest of the Gospels were ready in 1898. 9 years later. Acts was ready in 1905. And by the way, his text was the Northumbrian text of Amiatinus. Okay, at this time we've got an important interruption of the work. So far, what do we have? We've got the four Gospels and Acts. Matthew comes first, 1889, Mark, Luke, and John, 1898, Book of Acts, 1905. At this time, the British and Foreign Bible Society steps in and asks them, White, Wordsworth now instead of Wordsworth and White, and asks them for a minor edition of the entire Vulgate New Testament. But you see, all they've done is up to Acts, though. Now, that's more than half of the New Testament. When you get through four long Gospels. Well, Mark is relatively short, but you get through the long one, which is Luke, and the next to longest one, which is Matthew, and the third longest one, which is John, and the shortest one, which is Mark, and you get through 28 chapters of the book of Acts. You've done a large part of the New Testament, but still, you've just given us the evangelists, the Gospels, and you've given us the history of the church in Acts, but none of the Pauline corpus, none of the Petrine corpus, and still a large section of the Johannine corpus is still missing in 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and the book of Revelation. So, but what they're wanting, they want right away, immediately, they want a minor edition. It doesn't have to be anything exhaustive, but a minor edition of the entire Vulgate New Testament. So, they want to satisfy British and Foreign Bible Society, so they kind of stop their exhaustive work and change gears and change the way in which they do things, and they hurriedly run through the rest of the New Testament. And just taking the best known variants. without really doing a lot of comparing and contrasting. Just what's the better known? Take the better known of the variants. Now White, I had to say this lest you think they just didn't do, any homework at all. White did give a critical apparatus with variant readings from 7 other manuscripts of the whole New Testament and 2 of the Gospels. So he was doing some type of homework. He wasn't just running through it and translating, or running through it and just copying from the English Northumbrian Codex of Omniatenus and just putting it down in his work and claiming it to be his own, and not even giving us the benefit of discussion in a CA of the various variants that are available. He's doing his homework. He's looking into things. So he gives us a minor CA where he compares variant readings of 7 different manuscripts for the entire New Testament and 2 specifically for the Gospels. And this work was published by the British and Foreign Bible Society in 1911. But of course, White knows that can't stand, that can't last. We've already done an exhaustive amount of research into the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts. So after we have this little interlude here, I'm just trying to show you this little British and Foreign Bible Society parenthesis here. After we have this little parenthesis of, after we've done the Gospels and Acts, now let's hurriedly do the entire New Testament. Outside of the parentheses, let's go back and start with Romans now. We finished the Gospels, we finished Acts, we've got to go back and start with Romans and work our way through the Apocalypse, through the book of Revelation, to stay on track with our original purposes and intents, which was to give a definitive modern edition of the Latin Vulgate, and not something that's just hurriedly produced for the sake of the British and Foreign Bible Society. So White went back to work on the larger work. Volume 2, which is going to include several books. Volume 2 began with Romans. The first volume includes the 4 Gospels and Acts. By the time you're through with it, it'll have all of that. Volume 2 began with Romans, which was published in 1913. This is the second volume. Now these are the works that are available today that you could find in a good library. Volume 2 began with Romans in 1913, and it concluded with the book of Hebrews in 1941. And of course, if you notice the dates, we're beyond the time of Wordsworth and White now. They have since died by this time. And I'll mention the other scholars who come on the scene here, but it still goes by the name of Wordsworth and White, since they provided the footing for it. Volume 3 of the General Epistles, or the Catholic Epistles, is published in 1949. Volume 3 of the Catholics in 1949. And then also in Volume 3, as it later came to be called, the Book of Revelation in 1954. That's how recent you see this work is. Although we're going to look at some that's even more recent, though. Now, the later stages of this work were done by 2 other scholars. H.F.D. Sparks, 3 initials, H.F.D. Sparks, and his assistant, A.W. Adams. So really we have 4 men involved: Wordsworth, White, Sparks, and Adams. And Wordsworth did the least of it, you see. And then White came on the scene and really got things going, but then it takes Sparks and Adams to round everything out. Therefore, the entire project took 77 years from the date 1877, or 65 years after the first facsimile of Matthew was available in 1889. Depends on where you want to date it. If you want to date it from when the first work was published, the first facsimile of Matthew, then it's only 65 years. But from whenever they began their work, which is how I would date it, it was a work that took 77 years, which is one good full lifetime. It's just that a 1-year-old child couldn't have begun the project, So really one person couldn't do it. If you could begin at 1 and finish when you're 77 or 78, you'd have it done then. But it's going to take several people involved because it goes over a couple of generations. So we got a work that takes over half a century to complete. with different scholars in different environments, with different manuscripts available, and I think that that would obviously imply a strain of development that should be able to be seen as you go from Wordsworth to White and Sparks and Adams and through the years. I think we would see a definite and obvious strains of development. And we do. Here's what we have in the development. Wordsworth was only interested in giving us the correct text. He had little time for the history of the text, which includes all the discussions of the variants. That was not a concern of his really at all. He was only concerned about just giving us the correct text according to his knowledge and not providing us with any history of the text. So we don't really see variants from the Old Latin manuscripts. You see, now those are going to be important ones, the Old Latin, because those antedate Jerome's Bible. We don't really see variants from the Old Latin manuscripts until we get up into Luke. And we can kind of guess that by this time White is the one who's supervisor of the work that's being done. So I think the chief strain of development that we're going to see is the interaction of the scholars with the important variants of past history. Wordsworth is not interested really at all. White is definitely more interested, comes into play really beginning in the Gospel of Luke. We have important OL or Old Latin variants popping up. Begins to increase very much with Acts, and then even more so as you go from Romans through Revelation. As we get into the epistles, we even start seeing citations from the church fathers in Latin also appearing. So we're much more concerned about the critical apparatus. And remember, we're going through the history now of Tischendorf and Lockman and Tregelles, Westcott and Hort. They're on the scene at this time. People are becoming more aware of the fact that the variants in textual criticism are the most important things that you can study and look for in research. So you have to interpret what they're doing in the light of the context, the historical context in which they're performing this work. We just see a rise in the recognition of the importance of textual variants. And so these men are not remiss in giving us the variants as they see them, whether it's Old Latin, now all the way when we get to the epistles up into the church fathers, and so forth. Okay, we're going to come back and say something about that here in a moment, but let's give ourselves number 6 this morning, which is the last big number we'll look at. Martinet, Valarsi, Bentley, Lockman, Wordsworth, and White. Number 6, we have a Vulgate Commission. A Vulgate Commission. Now, because so much had been discovered in recent times, and it was felt that the Clementine text never really satisfied the Tridentan decree, that a new text for the Vulgate was planned by Pope Leo XIII last century. But it was planned, but nothing was really ever done. You know what committees are for? Yep. Take minutes and waste hours. Yeah. It wasn't until 1907. I mean, that's really true about committees, let me tell you. If you've ever been anywhere near a church committee, you know that they're busy taking minutes while they waste hours. It'd be much easier just to appoint someone to tell us what to do and let's just do it. Amen. Rather than argue for 14 years over, well, I think that's what we ought to do, and then you all die before you ever do anything about it. And that happens. I mean, you've already seen this with the Vulgate. It happens all the time. You just argue over doing it, and when you finally decide what you want to do, it's too late to do it. Someone beats you to it, you know. Or it's out of date, or they've invented something new, or you all are pushing up daisies by then. So it wasn't until 1907 under Pope Pius X that they finally started doing something. And it takes a long time to do something about the thing that you're doing something about. He appointed the International, this is the name of the commission, the International Commission for the Revision of the Latin Vulgate. So they start up a commission. That's always a good thing to do. Back in the Second World War, it was the WPA. we piddle around. It was supposed to be Works Progress Administration. But that's when they invented things like, if you don't have anything to do, then type numbers out of a telephone book and look like you're busy. We'll pay you for it. And so at least people have jobs, during lean times. We piddle around is what they named it. Some of the people back in those days said, Works Progress. Nothing was progressing. It was we piddle around. If you've ever watched road crews work, you know how they do. 14 of them are leaning on shovels, and one of them is directing them how to lean properly on your shovel. When you see these signs that say men working, they generally say slow men working. You got to read it correctly. Slow men working. Very slow. They're very slow. He appointed F.S. Gasquet as the head of the International Commission for the Revision of the Latin Vulgate. F.S. Gasquet, Gasquet, who lived 1846 to 1929. But the problem with Gasquet is that he became a cardinal and he moved to the Vatican in 1914. So that took him out of the commission. Took him out of commission. He became a cardinal and moved to the Vatican in 1914. Beginning of the First World War. That's an important date. So here's what the commission was supposed to do. We're criticizing them. They actually did do some important work. But it's interesting how you have to make sure everything is real formal before you actually do it. Do we have a secretary? Or are we going to take the minutes properly? Have we voted? Do we have a secretary-treasurer here? We've taken up the offering. Is it time to do it? Okay, now let's start. Instead of just doing the work. You're so busy getting ready to do it that you never do anything. Their commission was to search all places, and particularly Spain, for manuscripts hitherto unknown or unused earlier. So it was a search and seek out type of mission, which is going to involve a lot of legwork and cobwebs and running around dusty libraries and monasteries, particularly in Spain, looking for hitherto unknown or unused manuscripts. Now, of course, remember what we're looking at. Wordsworth and White, are they Catholics or Protestants? They're Protestants. They're Anglican scholars. So since they're giving us a tremendous new work, the Catholics have to counteract that, you see. So that's why this started. Notice the date. It starts right after Wordsworth and White really get off the ground and get going. This is Roman Catholic here. Wordsworth and White was Protestant. So they're kind of, this was the Catholic's revision of the work, the response to the work that was begun by the Protestants, Wordsworth and White. Now, as far as the papal decree was concerned, the way they got around that is everybody just pretended like they forgot about it. No new decree came on and annulled that one. They didn't try to hide the work in the larger volumes of Jerome's writing. It's just that was so many centuries ago, it's not totally reliable or relevant for today. So how did they deal with that? With the decree of Sixtus, they just really didn't deal with it. You just forgot that pretended like you forgot that it was ever decreed. Okay, in the year 1933, they moved to the Benedictine Abbey of Jerome in Rome. So that by osmosis you'd pick up some things from Jerome since you're in his abbey there. Somehow things would rub off on you. Since 1933 they've been there. And by the way, they're still there. They're maybe not the original men, but they're still there. They're still in the Benedictine Abbey of Jerome in Rome. The first volume was produced by the Vatican Press of Genesis in 1926. By 1969, they had reached the 13th volume, which was Isaiah. And today, they are continuing the work. It's still not been concluded. As a matter of fact, they haven't even concluded the Old Testament yet. But they're toward the very end of the Old Testament now, which will be quite some work whenever it's totally through. probably on the order of a Wordsworth-White. Assuming that they're honest and they're dealing with the text, there's no reason to think otherwise. It'll be a tremendous monumental work whenever the Roman Catholic scholars complete it. So the first thing published in 1926, and now in 1986, half a century and a decade later, they're just at the very end of the Old Testament, up into the minor prophets, I believe. Okay, past number 6, this isn't a new number, this is just some more things tacked on to round out our study. The latest complete critical edition. See, this Vulgate one is not complete, and the Wordsworth-White has been complete now for many decades. The last complete critical edition of the Vulgate was a German one that was produced by R. Weber. First initial R. Weber, W-E-B-E-R, in 1969, which includes the entire Bible, including the Apocrypha, and including certain spuria, such as the Epistle to the Laodiceans. So that's the most complete recent work that's come about in Vulgate studies. 1969. It's not available in English, though. It's a German work done by a German scholar. And the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, with the Apocrypha, with spuria, such as the Epistle to the Laodiceans. Now, it was done under the supervision of both Roman Catholic and Protestant scholars. It used manuscripts not previously used in revisions of the Vulgate. It's an entirely new work. And it differs in many places, both from SC, the Sixto Clementine, and WW, the Wordsworth-White. Differs in many places from both of them. Those are the two big editions of the Vulgate you have to be familiar with, Sixto Clementine and Wordsworth-White. Okay, do you remember that Jerome had done 3 editions of the Psalter? He had done the Roman Psalter, he had done the Gallican Psalter, that really became the important one, and then later, once he knew Hebrew, he had gone back and done a Hebrew Psalter. He had done all 3 of those. A new Latin Psalter, which was done from Jerome's Hebrew Psalter, not a revision of any of Jerome's earlier Psalters, was produced by a papal commission in 1945. See, the Gallican was, remember, the one always used in Catholic circles, with the exception of 2 churches back in Italy which used the Roman one. The Hebrew the Hebrew was done because the other 2, the Roman and the Gallican, were done in Greek. That's why Hebrew was done, but it's really not been used by anybody. Until finally this century, a new Latin Psalter has been produced that has come from Jerome's Hebrew Psalter, 1945. And authority has been given by the Roman Catholic Church for the use of it in Roman Catholic circles today, instead of the earlier inadequate ones, both the Roman and the Gallican. It's not been followed through in any universal sense, that's for sure, the Roman Catholic usage of it, but they certainly have been authorized to use this new Latin. Of course, you have to know Latin, or get a Greek or get an English copy of this new Latin one, which is a new copy of Jerome's Hebrew one. And so I think the Gallican one is still the one that's essential in Roman Catholic circles. That leaves me with abbreviations before we wrap up our first session this morning. You understand all of that so far?
Amen.
So Wordsworth-White is complete now. Sixto Clementine is complete. Those are the 2 big monumental ones. This Vulgate Commission work will probably rank up there with those 2. We don't know how highly it will rank, but it will rank up there whenever it's finished. But, I mean, if it's taken them from 1926 to 86, 60 years to do the Old Testament, and they're not through with that yet, it'll be way into the next century, the next millennium, before they ever finish the New Testament. It's going to be a tremendously significant work whenever it comes on the scene. But until then, since none of the New Testament is even available, it's not spoken of that much and it's not used that much. But these other 2 are the well-known ones. Now, the best well-known and the most important one, obviously, is Wordsworth-White. It embodies the principles and some of the work of Sixto Clementine, but it is a new work, though. It's a more recent one, 19th and 20th century work, you see. It's more recent. It has the availability of more Latin manuscripts, of better methods of study and textual comparisons and criticisms and so forth, which will make it better, therefore. So if you understand that, that's all that I'm asking you to understand, especially to keep those couple of things in mind. And you'll see those, Sixto, Clementine, Wordsworth, and White. And I'm going to show you how and where you'll see them here in just a moment. Okay, abbreviations. Remember how we used to do abbreviations? We haven't done it in a long time. But all these little things that are found in your critical apparatus. Okay, Vulgate is just a small VG. If it's just a small VG, here's what it means. It means Vulgate where the Sixto Clementine, no, let me don't, I better not say degree, that, save that for next time, where the Sixto Clementine and Wordsworth and White have the same reading. Now that's important to know that if it just stands just a VG by itself, that means the Vulgate, but that's where the Sixto Clementine and the Wordsworth and White, these two major editions, where they agree with one another, where they have the same reading. Okay, then you have VG small cl, VGCL. This obviously means the Vulgate where the Clementine edition, Sixto Clementine, where the Clementine edition is being followed and it differs from WW. And then just reverse of that would be our third abbreviation here, a VGWW. This means Wordsworth and White. In other words, if you see in a variant down there and it has VGWW, it means this is found in Wordsworth and White, and at this point Wordsworth and White differs with Clementine edition. And just the converse is true here. A CL means this is a Clementine, and it's not the same as Wordsworth and White. And when you see no superscripts, neither CL nor WW, just the VG, both of those agree. The Clementine and the Wordsworth and White edition read the same at this point. And those are the three chief things, abbreviations, you'll see in your Greek New Testament CAs with regard to the Latin Vulgate.